Well, joining us now is Defence Fellow at Civitas Robert Clark, who also served 15 years in the British Army, including tours of Iraq and Afghanistan. Thank you for coming on the programme. So as we've been talking about throughout the show, it's 1 year on since the withdrawal from Afghanistan by the US. I mean, what is your sense of the legacy a year on from that withdrawal that many people regarded as disastrous in terms of how quickly the Taliban were able to take over? What are your thoughts?
I mean, it's important to separate the military operation, the withdrawal itself, from Kabul and the sort of strategic implications behind it. So the withdrawal itself militarily was a success. It was handled very well by the military and the Foreign Office who led it. But in terms of the legacy, 1 year on, it really serves to leave a bitter taste really in the mouths of many people who served and fought there, and particularly for the Afghans who are still stranded in Afghanistan, who are vulnerable to the Taliban's regime. We can see women and children are suffering the most. Ethnic minorities, including Shia Hazara, are being targeted and persecuted across Afghanistan. And the state of the country now, under the Taliban 1 year later, is indicative of the complete lack of control that they have.
Yeah, I just wonder, so we've heard lots of commentary about how it's much less safe than it was a year ago, for instance, but I wonder how you feel about how much safer or how much less safe it is than when Britain and America actually went in, because some people will have never lived, will have always lived under an Afghanistan that had Britain and America sort of backing it, and this is a completely new world for them.
Well, I mean, absolutely. Afghanistan's been in conflict one way or another for the last 40-odd years.
Yeah.
But in terms of the actual tangible security that was provided by British and American and other NATO troops during the 20-year campaign, it could be felt day to day by Afghan civilians. For example, women were allowed to go to work. They were allowed to leave the house unattended by male suitors. They had children were in school. Quite often, for example, in the rural south in Helmand, where British troops were largely based, we'd see, children go to school on a daily basis. So we could see the impact that the security provided by the British and Americans had.
But you say that, but ultimately the invasion wasn't... we didn't go in order to ensure that some kids were able to go to school.
Or so we said.
It was... the strategy changed at different points. And ultimately, many people would say that the billions of dollars that were spent and the lives that were lost weren't necessarily for that goal, even though it was an important goal nonetheless. And so, therefore, the question is, do you think that it has changed anything in terms of what we think about intervention, and in the sense that it may not necessarily be something small or simple, that actually nation building is something incredibly significant and cannot be done perhaps in the mentality that too many people in the foreign sector had thought for decades?
Absolutely, you hit a really interesting point in terms of the idea of nation building and the limits of a sort of Western power, if you like. You could argue quite convincingly that the objectives of Afghanistan were met before the end of 2001, the removal of Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan, the training camps, and the removal of the Taliban regime who harboured them. The nation building that ensured was a noble and I think just cause by successive British governments on both sides of both parties. So I think the causes were noble and the aims were just. In terms of the sustainability of nation building operations, once the security had been met and a democratically elected government of one form was in power in Kabul, the sustainability for the British and American presence over the last few years was incredibly robust. We had less troops in Afghanistan, for example, than we still maintain in Germany. So the long-term costs of maintaining troops for what people call nation building can actually be relatively sustainable long-term.
I just wondered, of course, all of this started in 2001 when the Twin Towers had those horrific terrorist attacks perpetrated on them. And there'll be lots of people who would ask, are we safer now domestically, I'm speaking, are we safer from the threat of radical Islamist terrorism than we were back then? And in many ways, we're safer because of lots of different things, that came from the legacy of 9/11, for example, security, airport security, things like that. And I understand all that. But when you're talking about directly because of the British invading, are we safer now here domestically from terrorist attacks than before?
I think we were safer directly from terrorist attacks before. For example, the ability to keep terrorist forces and actors that would seek harm on British streets away, and the ability to do that in Afghanistan with troops there and a diplomatic presence, absolutely, it was safer. Now, with a return to the Taliban in power in Kabul, we can see obviously the power struggles on a daily basis with suicide bombings between the Taliban and the Islamic State in Khorasan province, who are actively undermining Western and British security interests. They do pose a direct threat to British national security. And now that we've removed forces from Afghanistan, and including the diplomatic presence to do with that as well, it makes it intrinsically more difficult to try and combat the radicalisation effect which IS still pose in Afghanistan. And just to highlight as well the recent removal of Ayman al-Zawahiri, the Al-Qaeda chief from Kabul as well. That demonstrates that the lack of intelligence that we have in Afghanistan on the ground and the reluctance on local actors who may have different, obviously, views to our own and different objectives. It does highlight the fact that we are at more risk now than we were when we had troops in Afghanistan.
Well, thank you so much for bringing your insights. Robert Clark, Defence Fellow at Civitas, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I mean, it's one thing about the terror threat from abroad, but we also have a huge problem with homegrown terror in this country as well. So.
Do you remember 9/11? Because 9/11 is one of my first proper memories. I mean, I would have been 6 at the time, but do you remember it? You're a bit younger than me.
I was 4, yeah.
So do you not?
No, I don't.
Yeah, it's my first real memory, and it was only a few months after I actually came to the UK, because I came to Britain as a child. And so it's my first proper memory of kind of being in this country and a big event happening. So yeah, it's strange now when I meet people like some of our producers. They were way too young to remember. Some of them are born after 9/11, which is bizarre to me. I'm like, why does your birthday begin with a 2?
It is interesting because I do think events like 9/11 and many others were so significant internationally and culturally that they become generation-defining events, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, GB Views at GB News, let us know what you